theorist. So can I ask you, what is a literary theorist and critic?
Well, literary critic is different from literary critics look at novels. Let's use that as the main example because that's what the genre that I work with, or the form, and they go in and analyze social contexts and meanings. So they're kind of coming at it from that perspective of understanding what does a text mean and how does it fit within our social world. What's it telling us about the values that we have as a community, as a society, as a nation, or whatever, in whatever context, or in an historical context. Literary theorists look at the way novels give shape to meaning in many ways, and how they, and what the formal features of them are to create the meaning effects that they create. So novels create meanings, which are the stories they convey. And beneath the overarching story, the obvious elements of a character did this, went there, experienced this, did that, blah, blah, blah. There are thematic meanings and symbolic meanings that come underneath all that and that are conveyed through a story. And in broad terms, romance as a category has a particular meaning or set of meanings that we recognize, and we recognize the genres of a romance. And as a theorist, I might try to understand by looking at a range of texts what it is about the genre of romance that connects different types of novels or different novels and stories, and what it is about romance that it's conveying. What is romance telling us? So that's what a theorist might do. My special interest is in the novel form, and how I'm really interested in how to engage readers, because obviously writers want to get people reading and they want to sustain reading. They want people to keep turning those pages. So what is it in theoretical terms that you can do as a writer to hold your readers' interest? There's more to it than just creating interesting scenarios. It's how you present those scenarios, and it's the work that you give the reader, because readers, whether they realize it or not, need to have some work to do. And you've got to strike a balance between giving the reader enough work to do so that they become involved in creating this virtual world that you're generating through your writing. But you don't want to give them so much work to do that they have to think too hard or become confused. So you want to avoid boring the reader by telling them more than they need to figure out what's going on. And you want to avoid confusing them by not giving them enough information.
I have a question about that. Is there any particular genre that, like the happy medium for depth versus, I guess it would be plot, keeping it simple versus digging into that narrative tension? Does that work better for some genres than others?
You're talking about distinctions like between literary fiction and commercial fiction, I think, because I like to think about it as going back to, I'm using an analogy, a structural metaphor of beginning, middle, and end, right, which is based on a diurnal pattern, the passage of the sun across the day, which has an impact on us organically. And when I think about narrative structure, when we try to understand concepts like beginning, middle, and end, the beginning is the sunrise, the end is the sunset, and what happens in the middle is usually a moment of clarity, because when the noonday sun shines down on us, the shadows are almost gone, and the light is typically brighter. But of course, we have seasonal impact on the way the sun casts its light upon the earth. And I like to think of commercial fiction as a summer's day, because what commercial fiction does is it offers greater clarity in what the insights are that characters and readers need in order to understand the story. What's this about? What happens in the middle is that process that you're involving the reader in of working out that 2 + 2 = 4 along the way has a kind of a high point moment of clarity around the middle of the narrative, when a character, or if not the protagonist, then another character, or collectively, it's presented in a way for the reader to have this, right, that's what this is about moment, that then enables them to understand the deeper motivations and what's at stake in the final push to the conclusion. So commercial fiction is like a summer's day. The sun's shining down. It's clear. You'll have, if we look at film, for example, like blockbusters like San Andreas with Dwayne Johnson. It was, I think it's about 2016 it was made. We know the beginning, a man who's lost his family because he had a tragic accident, lost a child, and emotionally his world fell apart. He couldn't connect with his family anymore. And the end result is that he gets his family back. He can't resurrect his dead daughter, but he reconnects with his wife and surviving child. And in the middle, there's a moment where he has a realization that he's got to go out and save his family, that they're still his family, obviously, and he's got to go out and save them. And it's commercial it's a blockbuster. It's commercial because it makes clear statements along the way about what this is about. It makes clearer statements or representations. It doesn't say this is about family, but it has a stronger focus on that, and it pushes those characters and aspects of relationship to the fore. With literary fiction, I think of it as winter, because in wintertime, the sun is at a lower angle and there's less clarity because, you know, the weather is different. There's less clarity about the sun. The shadows that are cast in winter are not as defining. At midday, you will more likely see longer shadows, and shadows cast things in darkness. So symbolically, literature has less clarity. It embraces ambiguity to a greater degree. And so when you're talking about depth, you're really talking about different styles of writing that ask certain things of the reader. In one sense, a work of commercial fiction, and a romance might be literary fiction. You can have a romantic genre as literary fiction. That might push it more into springtime, you know, in terms of feeling and mood. But it's going to focus on the actions and the material events and the reader's enjoyment, their emotional engagement in the whole experience of what romance is. In a literary work, it's going to perhaps ask or offer readers scope to mull things over after reading has finished, because as well as the overarching story, there are those layers that you talk about where you can think about, wow, you know, in the way that if we look at other commercial genres like zombie fiction or films, they convey meanings. I was watching a film called The Purge Forever, and that had a political undertone to it.
Forever?
It wasn't just, yeah, but I was surprised. I thought it had a political undertone about, it placed 2 million Americans on the other side of the border in Mexico as refugees at the end of the film. And so there were thought-provoking elements to what was really, you know, a gory bloodfest. It had literary qualities to it, the kind of depths that you're asking about. So it's possible to produce commercial fiction or film in a way that has those underlying layers that invites audiences and readers to reflect a little bit more deeply about the story and the subject matter and the themes after they've finished reading. And what cognitives, just an interesting side issue, cognitives psychologists who study what happens when we read, talk about reading in terms of online reading when you're doing it, and offline reading, the stuff that happens after you've put that book down. You know, when you go for a walk and you think, you're mulling over Game of Thrones or something, and you're thinking about what's happened. That's offline reading. And it might be deeply cerebral and abstract, or it might simply be that you're still in that world. You know, I love watching for some reason, I love Scandi noir and stuff like that. And I like watching films that are set in icy landscapes, probably because I'm living in a warm environment. And the other day I was laughing with a friend because I said, I had a moment when I was out walking and I thought, I don't have any waterproof pants. And it's because I've been so immersed in watching these snow-capped films, I was thinking, I haven't got any snow gear, So that was an offline moment. Yeah. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
I've never heard of the diurnal patterns, and I love that analogy. I think I write winter if I had to pick. How about everybody else? Does everyone else want to put in the chat? Do you know what season you write? Desiree. So it's like immersion that they talk about in making video games. Do you want to expand on that, Desiree?
Sure. I'm not a video game programmer. I never go into that industry. They destroy people there. But they talk about it when they're creating video games and the storylines in video games, and how much immersion that they can get people. And this is why you see people who will play for hours and hours and hours, because they can become so immersed in the story and so immersed in what's happening that they will forget time. It's kind of a flow. It's almost like flow. Programmers get into a flow. I mean, so to immersion into a storyline, thinking about movies, I still remember when I saw The Lord of the Rings, the very first one, and it was going on and on and on, and then they get in the boat and they're floating off, and I'm like waiting for the next thing to happen. And I didn't realize that movie was 3 hours long, because I just lost all sense of track of any time. Yeah. And then afterwards, I kept thinking about everything. And it's not like I didn't read the Lord of the Rings. I read it in high school. So, I was familiar with it, but the immersion that happens, and then when the movie is over, you're left wanting more, and you keep thinking back on it. And there have been a couple of books that I've read. A couple of years ago, I read a book. It was a romance book called Rapture by this lady, or the author's name is N.N. Brett. And, to me, romance has always been just read it and then, on to the next. But that one, even now, I remember parts of that particular book that stuck out, and it keeps it just keeps winding and winding. And that's what I'm talking about, is this immersion that brings you back into the story constantly.
Yeah, there's a theoretical basis for all that, and it's got to do with our nature as organic beings and the role that feeling has to play in determining our actions and providing us with a kind of a reward for things that are good for us, pleasant feelings and unpleasant feelings. So which then become elaborated into emotions in different situations. With immersion, that happens because language has this capacity. It's the way it works for us. Cognitive psychologists have looked into this, that certain words are actually grounded in physiological experience. So, for instance, if I say the word lick or pick, to pick something up, pick a piece of paper up, or kick, you've all heard those words. The internal infrastructure for actually licking, kicking, and picking has been partially activated in your brains, but it hasn't gone all the way. It hasn't gone all the way to your fingertips, so to speak. So writing that uses grounded language and involves the reader in imagining material actions, like even simple movements like picking an object up. And I've read stories where someone's described cleaning a weapon or baking a cake or anything like that and felt immersed in it. If you lean into our shared humanity, don't overstate it, but focus on those aspects of an experience that people will recognize and that will help them understand exactly what's happening in the world that you're presenting, then you stand a greater chance of creating an immersive experience for your reader. And that's all to do with the way our brains work and use language. We build our experience of a text that we're reading, the virtual world, out of fragments of ordinary day-to-day experience, personal experience. We all know what it's like to kick something, pick something up. We know what it's like to feel hot, to feel cold, all those basic sensual experiences of life. And if you use those as building blocks to the longer or broader narrative that you're building in terms of the storyline, you'll stand a greater chance of creating opportunities for immersion.
This reminds me of deep point of view narration. And since we have a narrative expert here, I'm so curious what you think about this type of narrative style.
We call it different things. We talk about focalization. So the terminology that's used by literary theorists and narrative theorists is how the narrative is focalized. Because in many literary works, point of view isn't limited to one character or to the protagonist. So, but increasingly with contemporary fiction, the preference is to avoid confusing the reader, because you can if you hop around too much. So I suspect that deep point of view refers to styles of narration that focus on internal experience and not just what can be seen through the visual metaphor, through sight. So that's that instance of describing a character. I was thinking, what example can I give you for illustrating some aspects of what I wanted to discuss today? And one way to do it would be to talk of a story where you've got a character named, let's call him Jake, who is in a supermarket and finds himself at the long end of a queue. He's at the tail end of a queue. Now, you can either just describe it like that, or you can really lean into the experience of coming out of he's coming out of an aisle. He can't see what's going on. He can see some people standing down the end of the aisle. And when he gets down the end of the aisle, he has to turn right because the queue's down the end. I'm not writing that now, but you could actually describe him walking to the end of the aisle, seeing the queue and turning right because he's got to go, another few rows back in order to get to the end of the line. And you could describe aspects that reflect his frustration. You could describe him standing behind a guy with a baseball bat and his shopping trolley. It's maybe a supermarket where he can buy sporting goods, and how the baseball bat keeps getting in the way because he's, this is before social distancing, say, and he keeps moving the trolley and knocking the guy. You can describe all those kinds of things to help a person feel like they're situated in the experience. And at the same time, you use those kind of descriptions for a reason, because in 5 minutes' time, a zombie's going to walk into the building and Jake's going to grab that bat and whack him with it. So you set things up, but you make the elements of your story work as much as you can in priming the reader for future action so that they'll understand what's going to happen. And because if you just pull a baseball bat out of thin air, they're not going to like that. They want to be able to understand that what the environment is, what the character has close to hand that he can use. With film, it would mean filling the mise en scène with the material that the protagonist can use to defend himself. In film, everything you see in shot is everything that's available. So if there's a baseball bat in that corner or a weapon, then you know as a viewer what's there. Because you can't create a visual picture in the way that a film can, you have to create that visual picture by layering the narrative with all the elements that you need down the track. You've got to prepare the reader and prepare your character. Yeah.
I used to think that red herrings and planting seeds were for mystery novels, and I was so wrong. Everything can be a seed. And
Yes.
I've had to go over my 25th manuscript revision, just trying to think, okay, what else can I make into a seed? Because it's so much more satisfying when subconsciously you read something and it clicks. The twist
Yes.
makes sense because it was all
Yes.
planted, even though it's just the writer setting it
Yes.
all up in reverse.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. And as a reader, you find that satisfying. So you need to do that as a writer, and that
Yes.
will satisfy your readers. You've just led me into this idea about backstory and a comparison that we can make with film, because in films, particularly it's more evident in commercial films, they tend to talk about having an inciting incident. And the reason films lean into this concept of having an inciting incident that kind of kickstarts the action, or the main elements of the story, is because they can't lay a backstory in the way that we can through writing. To lay a backstory into a film, you need to use things like flashback and voiceover narration. And if you ever do that stuff, it really slows things down, and it's a bit. Voiceover narration for me is fine in a kind of comic narrative like The Princess Bride or something like that, but there are some more serious narratives, like I think The Age of Innocence by Scorsese, where it works because he's adapting a novel to film, and it's got a particular thrust, emotional thrust and theme that he's trying to get across. So, but with our writing, with written work, backstory is really there to do a lot of the work that inciting incidents do in film. And that really is about seeding elements of existing unresolved tension into your forward movement. When I see relatively new writers, there was one writer I was working with last year, and I realized that what she was doing, everything she was writing was highly retrospective, that she hadn't jumped into the forward momentum of the story, and that instead she'd situated the starting point of her story so that everything that was relevant, that should have been moving forward, was actually something she was reflecting on in the past, as though it had, something as the deep past. So she was heavily invested in this kind of retrospective kind of writing, which some writers can fall into early on. And really, your narrative has got to have a forward movement, and the past is woven into that forward movement through backstory. And backstory is, you can get over any blocks you've got about backstory if you realize that everything has backstory. Material objects have a backstory. You can use them to create backstory. The picture behind me has a backstory. The printer behind me has a backstory. The plant in the corner, the stapler on my desk has a backstory that's relevant to me, because I remember being so excited when I got it, because I really wanted this kind of stapler. It's easy to staple things with, and you can kind of open it up, and it's fabulous.
Looks like a really good stapler.
It is good. It's an awesome stapler. But what's the point of it? It's got to be relevant to the story. And so you've got to find, you sew in elements through, say your character has a backstory that relates to a failed romance or relationship. The backstory is in the sofa where they used to sit with their partner. It's in the wardrobe. It's in the shoes that they wore on their first date. It's in the pantry where their former partner's favourite items are still kind of sitting in there nestled, the chili sauce or whatever. So backstory is everywhere, and there's opportunities to lean into it as much as you can when you need to, when you're going through the forward aspects of the story. And you can do it in ways, if you do it, in those kind of ways that integrate objects as they're being used, as they're being observed in the present forward movement of the story, and just give them a little tale that reflects the backstory without necessarily having to go into lengthy chunks, then you'll find it easier to see those kind of elements and create the narrative tension that you need.
I have one info dump in my story. I think that my exposition is spread out evenly, but for this one part where there's a ring and my character is supposed to sell this ring and gets into the backstory of it, and I'm quite married to the backstory of the ring. So when it comes to objects, I guess the Lord of the Rings is an example. Objects that are so important to the storyline. Is there a different way of going about spreading out that exposition and that backstory? Or
firstly, I wouldn't diss exposition because it has a part to play. You know, there's a lot of damage done by this idea about show, don't tell. Showing's important, but telling is relevant too. And it's understanding what those two different modes of writing and communicating are doing that will ensure that you make effective use of them, and your reader won't notice that you're in a telling mode, expository mode. So what you use telling for is when you need to, so for instance, going back to Jake in the supermarket, detailing his experience of actually coming up to a shopping queue that's really long might not be all that good. It might not create enough tension, and certainly as an opening to a novel, it's not going to work. And so maybe you just need to say Jake was in Walmart or wherever he was at the end of an impossibly long queue, waiting for, in the queue, when a zombie ran in and bit the manager, whatever. However you want to start it, there are times when you need to lay down the details quickly, and so that you can be selective about the details that you actually go into through sensual description and grounded terminology. So you might prefer to go into a description of what this guy who walks into the store looks like, that he's pale, that he's got this enormous gash across his neck, that everybody's looking at him, that people are looking to one another, that some woman starts crying because she's distressed at the sight, that the manager walks up, and says, hey, can we help you? Do you want me to call you an ambulance or whatever? You might want to go into those details because you can do a better job than I did just then of explaining the nature of the situation and the terror that people are beginning to realize when they see someone who's got obviously a life-ending wound, which indicates he's a zombie, obviously.
obviously.
Obviously. So exposition or those kind of, if you're doing a fast-paced scene where there's a chase, there will be moments where you need to cut to the chase and just tell the reader what's happening. In terms of chunking backstory, that's okay if you create a kind of a little, depends how long it is, but you can create a kind of sensual, engaging experience with the past. You can do it just like you can with a forward experience. And we see that in flashback in film, that flashbacks in film often take us into the past and bring it to life as though it's happening right now. And that's what you can do with any relevant backstory to an object like a ring. You could take that character back to a moment where they perhaps got the ring or the circumstances surrounding it. And you do that by entering into their interiority, perhaps. This is what you were talking about, I think, with point of view. That's, what did you call it?
Deep point of view narration.
Deep point of view. Yeah. It's what we're talking about is entering into a character's subjectivity, their experience of the world, and then they're reflecting on their past. So you want to avoid doing that too much because it's claustrophobic to be in someone's head. You've got to get them out, get the reader out of the head and into the world. But you can take them into the head, in and out of the head and into them. And you can do it in small doses through what's called different strategies like free and direct discourse, where you are conveying thought, but doing it through the narrative voice, if it's in a third person narrative voice. Jane Austen's famous for doing that. So there are techniques for sewing elements of backstory into your narrative. And large chunks of backstory can be dealt with effectively in the way that you're talking. If you've got an important object and you need to lay down the past, that's possible. It's hard to tell how successful it is without looking at it.
I think I'm starting to understand what a literary theorist is by listening to you, and how you use this multidisciplinary approach. You're really incorporating neuroscience and cognitive science and psychology and
Yes.
philosophy, and we're really talking about exploring what it means to be human, and not just be artists and writers and tell interesting stories, but get deep with the characters. And I love that there's this idea of clarity with the summer, a summer season of blockbusters versus more literary wintry novels, but there's still this infusion for a really good blockbuster or a really good romance, like Desiree was talking about. There's all of this hitting you with, I'd say, a lot of psychology.
Yeah.
The psychology element is just as important as the structural element, or it's all the same thing, actually, if you're doing it well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The psychology element around it is about the reader enjoyment. And that's about connecting with the fact that your reader, your humanity as a writer needs to connect with the humanity of the reader through your shared experiences. And even if you haven't had shared experiences like those described in the novel, and you probably don't want them to have shared experiences like that, because that can be triggering sometimes for people. If you're writing something fast and pacey and it's too much like a traumatic experience, then it will turn a reader off. That's why you want to build, interesting possibilities, and that's often why we create fictional worlds that are very different from our own. But yeah, you're connecting with the fundamental aspects of what it is to be an organic being living in the world, getting up every day, understanding that the day has a beginning and that things have to be done in the day and that it's time bound, and that by sunset we are going to be in a position where we've either achieved what we needed to achieve or we haven't. And understanding that pattern is on repeat every day, that's one way to understand what needs to happen in your novel in terms of the structure and how the reader is going to feel about it as different elements of the structure are being played out. Yeah.
I just watched Seinfeld, the whole thing, for the first time in my life, and they make a point all throughout the show to stress that the show is about nothing. And they even do an Inception thing where in the show, Seinfeld gets a deal to make his own sitcom. And they're pitching the sitcom to NBC. And NBC's asking, what's the show about? And they're like, nothing. What do you do in a day? I get up and I go to work. And they're like, that's a show. And that's sort of all that Seinfeld is. And I think if you can master the mundanity, because I think people who have fun with themselves, like those people that love their own company, they're never bored, they're interesting to follow. So we can make those people in our stories. And you have sent us a workbook where we can explore beginnings, middles, and endings. And it seems that the middle, the midpoint, you have lots to say about that. And you talk about muddled middles. So can you explain a little more about this?
Well, if you think about films, and it's really good practice to get a film that you really like, that you're happy to watch over and over, and watch it with a view to just looking at around the middle stage of the narrative to see what happens. If we start out by thinking about the beginning and the end, we have the beginning to a story and the end of a story. We know what the outcome is, and the outcome has to somehow relate to the beginning. When we get in the middle, it's a moment where we're kind of focusing on, what's this all about? What is it really all about? Because what needs to happen in the middle to reward your reader so that they will feel like they are on track to understanding this story, not that they're consciously thinking, I've got to understand what this story is all about, is to give them a moment of insight, an opportunity to reflect upon aspects of the narrative. Usually it's done through character reflection, protagonist reflection, and it doesn't have to be deep and long. It can be aided by the build-up of symbolic material, so the objects and the events that are happening around the character. So, for instance, let's use a sci-fi kind of narrative where you have a young protagonist going out into space. They start with a friendship, they go through some academy with another character who later becomes an antagonist for whatever reasons you want to generate the conflict. Probably because the antagonist has had some sort of failed experience at the academy. It's often, this is a common sort of thing that's done, I think, in films, whether they're sci-fi or not. So they go on different routes. One's the protagonist, the other's the antagonist. And in the midpoint of a film like that, so obviously at the end of the narrative, there's probably going to be a climax where there's a battle, and in all likelihood, if it's commercial, the protagonist will win that battle. But at the midpoint of the narrative, the crisis point is the splitting of the friendship, whatever the inciting incident is that causes, which will be the failure of the antagonist and the fact that they feel ashamed or whatever, and they part company. That's the crisis point. The aha moment leading up the midpoint, you've got all this tension existing between antagonists and protagonists, however it's playing out in the universe, in the galaxy, and whatever they're doing with their spaceships. And you'll have a moment where the protagonist or somebody else reflects upon their relationship with this person, perhaps. The reader is now primed to understand, what is this all about? This is about people succeeding and failing and thriving, and what happens in situations of conflict is that people get alienated because the protagonist is thinking about his past friendship with this person and, perhaps nostalgically. Now, the protagonist isn't going to say, I'm thinking about how I'm lucky because things went well for me, and that means I'm a leader and I'm out there striding, surviving, thriving. I'm an admiral now, and he's just a lowly antagonist, doing battle in this galaxies over here and there. The reflection that he has on thinking about his past relationship is where he'll have an aha moment and thinks, he's probably over in that galaxy over there because it's where his mother came from. And he always used to say to me when we were laughing and chatting that he'd go back there one day. So I know where he's hiding out, and I'm going to take the battle to him there. But so he has a moment of insight that brings the whole story together at the same time that it's brought together for the reader that this is about hero making and conflict, and the failures that are involved in forming conflict. So that middle section, you don't want to lay it out to your reader and tell them this is what the story is about, but you want to give them everything that's leading up to that middle point, is supplying them with the material that they need to make those kind of ordinary day-to-day assessments that we might make as parents when we see our kids struggling or try and understand the dynamics of certain relationships. So it's those elements that feed into what's called the midpoint or the aha moment, which is that point of clarity. It's a point of clarity for the character, And it should provide opportunities for clarity for the reader, just to reinforce for them what this story is about underneath it all. It's not just about a battle for the galaxy, it's about a failed friendship. And we see that when we look at commercial films. You can see that there's always this sort of other thread coming through, that these kind of battles aren't just one track, they have multi-tracks feeding into them. And so understanding the different avenues that you're using to bring your story together will help you develop that moment in the middle where there's a point of clarity for the protagonist or for the other characters, if it's not the protagonist, and a moment of clarity, an opportunity for the reader to say, oh yeah, I know, I recognize this. This isn't, even though I've never been into outer space, I've had this stuff happen to me before.
Is the midpoint aha moment always the true aha? I've heard of with Jessica Brody, who takes her theories based off of Blake Snyder's screenwriting plot points, and she talks about the Dark Night of the Soul plot point that comes much later, basically in the third act, midway through the third act, where they might have realized something in the middle, but it was wrong, or they didn't fully realize it until later. So how many realizations are there places to put
they're
different
everywhere.
Okay.
And this is because the beginning, middle, and end structure. So the beginning of anything sets up the situation, the end is the resolution or conclusion, outcome, whatever. And the middle point is, what's this all about? And you can have that in a chapter, in a scene, at different points throughout the narrative. If you were to divide a film or a book into just the beginning, middle, and end, then there is a midpoint between the middle and the beginning, and there is a midpoint between the middle and the end. And the midpoint between the beginning and the middle is called the crisis point, usually. And the midpoint between the middle and the end is the climax. And so there are, so that overall structure of beginning, middle, and end, where there's what's this all about, a point of clarity, it's what's it all about for different stakeholders, really. And that's a useful way of thinking about it, actually. I just thought of that. You've got stakeholders in your novel. You've got protagonists, you've got readers, you've got other characters, antagonists, and whatever. So you can shift that around, narrow it, and bring it down to other stages in the story, in the way that you describe that theorist speaking about that second aha moment, which happens in the climax. There's always a moment in the climax where there's a moment of realization, always. Otherwise, it'd be very tedious, unrelenting. You've got to have something like that to give the reader a chance. To me, I think it's a little bit like a more, it's a meta version of the 2 + 2 = 4 strategy, where they tell you, don't give the reader 2 + 2 = 4, give them 2 + 2. What you're doing with midpoints, wherever you situate them in relation to beginnings and endings happening across your text, you're giving them an opportunity to realize something, to put 2 and 2 together on a larger scale by making use of all the information they've had across the narrative. It's a little bit like, there's an aha moment at the end of The Sixth Sense, and it happens right at the end, when everything is concertinaed together so that we see everything that's happened across the narrative in a shorter time frame with some additional information that we didn't have full access to, and we are able to realize what that story is really about, what actually happened. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and that was one of the only Sixth Sense references that did not have any spoilers. I feel like that's the easiest movie to spoil and book to spoil.
It is an easy one to spoil, yeah.
I think that there, by the way, if anyone has any muddled middle or narrative tension questions, you can just say me in the chat and I will stop talking. But I think that there are a lot of simplified plot structure books out there. Those are the types of books that I like to read because I'm, I suppose, not an advanced literary theorist. But I think about in some of these simplified structure books, how there's plot or A story and B story characters, and the pacing of these structures that are sort of formulaic, but you can throw in your own flair. Do you think that it's important to give all of your characters, like make sure these are A story, these are B story, here's their so-and-so's external and internal motivation. Everybody has to have an external and internal motivation. Like how mathematical do we have to get with our structure and our secondary characters?
I'm much more organic in my approach, I resist any formula. I don't see the pattern as formulaic at all. It is a pattern, and in the same way that a day, every day is different, and yet it follows the same pattern. We can't escape the pattern of the sun. Thankfully, we don't want to escape it because it gives us life. I think those kind of workbooks, I mean, they can help you think about key elements of story so that you address these when you're writing. But I don't know that every secondary character has to have like a fully drawn narrative arc. If you think about it, if you think about ordinary people coming together, you might have three friends coming together, and the central person is the person whose story is going to be told. And so our experience as readers or film viewers is going to capture the beginning of a situation that matters to this person and the end of that situation and the moment of clarity, what it's all about. That's all going to organize the story. Each of her two friends or his two friends will have, or their two friends will have their own emotional, experiential journeys that are playing out in completely different time frames. They might be reaching the conclusion. One friend might be reaching, if it's a story about career success, our protagonist might be building a quirky business that, you know, going it alone and trying something new and different. And each of her friends might be through different stages of their careers, of their vocational life. One might be well established in hers, another might be retiring or anything, anywhere along the line. But you're not necessarily going to, we don't care. I don't care about that aspect of their life. I only care about the aspect of their lives that relate to the story that is the focus of the narrative. Unless their personal stories are providing strands that you can have multi-perspectival narratives, unless those other stories are weaving together to create this kind of effect, then I don't know that, I think you're doing more work than you need to do. It just sounds to me like it's, you know, like writing out character traits and all that. I think it's much better to write by imagining characters in the situations that you want them to be in and actually thinking visually. So getting yourself in that space. If you're going to, have a look at a film like Gravity with Sandra Bullock and famous American actor, I've forgotten his name.
George Clooney?
George Clooney, yeah. That takes place in a very limited space. For the most part, the cabin of a capsule, a survival capsule. So to write that, you would need to get into that capsule in your mind and imagine, in the same way that the filmmakers needed to build a capsule that had all the bells and whistles on it, and they needed to build the backdrop of outer space with all the stars, and they needed to build the space debris, and they needed to build, microphones that could relay communications with space or whatever else is involved in that story. You need to build that physical space. And so to write a novel, I don't know, that film might have started as a novel. A lot of those films do. It would be a deeply detailed kind of expression of what it feels like to be in such an enclosed space in the depths of infinite space. And so you would have a lot of attention to the bells and the whistles and the dials and what they mean and any other stuff that's in there. And those details become relevant. I think there is a book that does this, and that's, is it called Mars? I read it a while ago.
Mission to Mars.
Mission Mars. Then the actor Matt Damon.
Yeah.
And they made the film. I've forgotten the name.
Anyone know it? Mars, something Mars, definitely.
Yeah. But if you read the book rather than watch the film, I started to watch the film, and I must admit, I think the book was better at creating the dynamics, the tension, and the crisis points, because it was built from the ground up. We couldn't see it. Film flashes everything on the screen so that you can see it all at once. But with fiction writing, you've got to lay it all down piece by piece and make decisions about how much detail you go into with the different aspects of the physical space that's being described. Yeah.
Well, we're coming up to the hour, and I want to respect everyone's time. But before we go, I wanted to talk for everyone, but also for myself, about your services that are so different to like the way you've structured it. You're not just theorizing, you're also providing services for authors. You're doing feedback, and and you have monthly types of memberships where authors can send in some like pieces of their writing. How does it work?
Right. So all the stuff we've been talking about, if the theory bores you to tears and you just want some feedback to help you get your writing on track, then I do that, and I don't bring all that theory into it. I might make little side notes about how, so that you understand what you need to do in the future. So that's one-to-one feedback offered on. I use the Wedding platform. I am available to chat by Zoom if that's the preferred method. And you can organise that. So it's a 3-monthly package that you buy with monthly instalments, and you can have your feedback structured how you like it. So if you want to have someone giving you feedback on a weekly basis, that's the preferred process. But some people slack off and then they don't get in touch with me, or I reach out to them and I say, well, are we doing this? How's it going? And that's okay too. If you don't use up your quota of words for the month, that's okay. You can carry it over. If I haven't done the work, if you haven't engaged me to do the work, then we can push it over a month or whatever, according to it. So you can start with, I've forgotten the size of the plans, but you can start with a small plan of, say, like 1,000 words a week, or you can have 3,000 words a week, or you can go right out and have 5,000 words a week. And the larger plan, the mid-range one, is the one most people are interested in. And the larger one is particularly good if you are at the end, say you've got a full draft, and what you really want to do is someone to give you feedback on the sections of the draft, so that you can, to aid your redrafting, so that you know what you need to do in order to tighten this narrative and make it the best it can be.
So I've posted a link to Victoria's page in the chat, and for anyone watching the replay, I'll post the link below the video as well. And this is different than developmental editing. This is specifically for picking up on these structural elements and muddled middles.
Whatever you need in relation to your writing. It's hard for me if I'm just looking at 3,000 words at a time. I won't see the full picture until I get a fair way into it. But if you attend to the minutiae, the small ongoing steps, you find that you will develop. The larger picture falls into place because I start recognizing we need to have something like this aspect needs to be addressed about now. As a reader, I read it from the position of being an expert reader, and I'll say in my feedback, as a reader, I'm confused. I don't know why this is happening. Or as a reader, I'm really interested in this aspect and I'd like to see a little bit more of it, something like that. That's one way that the feedback can work. I mean, look, all I can say about it is that I've had good results. I've only been doing this for a little while, and I've had good results with writers. Actually, I started just doing it for free. I have some pro bono clients, that one in the States, and within a couple of months she'd won first prize in a vocal media competition. The other one,
those are like $25,000.
Not that big one, no, but one that was there's fairly sizable prize money, and they're highly competitive. And another's been longlisted and shortlisted for major international novel prizes, where you read, where they read a fair chunk, like the first 10,000 words. I'm also a judge on Ink and Insights. I'm not sure if I can say that, but I am. And which is an international writing competition where you submit 10,000 words and you get detailed feedback. And and recently someone I gave him feedback on about 3 occasions through different drafts of his novel, and he's been agented. So, and credited my feedback with lifting his novel to a whole new level. So it's really about, it's not something that you'll need forever. It's a little bit like having a coach that can show you how to do things so that you can then take those steps yourself with your writing going forward. It's you know what it's like when you don't have the right equipment and you try to or if you don't read the manual and you try to put some flat pack furniture together. When I try to do odd jobs around the house, if I haven't got the right equipment, it's impossible. It takes me forever. And then I see, I get a friend or someone to come around and they do it in 5 minutes. It's that kind of thing that you suddenly get insights and that's why I emphasize that I'm teaching you stuff you already know, because I'm not asking you to learn theory. I've read all the boring, dry theory so that you don't have to. What I do is help you reconnect with what it is to be a reader by helping you think like a reader, so that your reader gets all the kind of information that they need to become involved in the story.
Well, I would love to have you read at least the first bit of my book, so you will be hearing from me.
Great, Jess.